Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. The end of the year is quickly approaching, so now it's time to get ready for CECL. Before we begin, I would like to let you all know that we are in presentation mode, so you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you have a question, please click the question icon on your screen, and we will answer all your questions towards the end of the webinar. You will also receive an email with the slides from this webinar, along with a link to the recording on our YouTube channel. My name is David Suri, and I've been working with Quick Rate and with credit unions for the last 16 years on both the sales side as well as on the service side as far as CECLSolver. We do also have Steve Huntington, our Director of Quick Analytics, on the call, and he does have over 20 years experience working with financial institutions. All right, so let's talk about CECL. One of the comments we hear on our demos is, what is wrong with the current incurred loss model?
Hey, David, if I can jump in for just 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
Make sure that we're recording the webinar for everybody, if you've started the recording yet.
This webinar is being recorded. It looks like, yeah, my apologies. I do want to mention that we are recording this webinar. It looks like, Steve, that we are recording this unless I'm missing a button. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So why the change is where we left off. This all goes back to the last crisis, and in FASB's opinion, they felt that the incurred loss model did a disservice to financial institutions by allowing them to not acknowledge losses until they were probable. This approach used to recognize impairment losses on financial assets has long been identified as a major weakness, resulting in delayed recognition of such losses. So at this point, FASB had a couple of options: fix the methodology or do nothing. If you do nothing and the problem reoccurs, then you expose yourself to people saying, well, why didn't you do anything to fix it? So clearly FASB decided that that was not going to be their solution. So they decided to fix it, and CECL was that fix. This means learning a new way to calculate your reserve. But at the end of the day, we're all just calculating a reserve. We like to say we're playing the same game, just with a new set of rules. We're still going to focus on reserves. We're just going to go about it in a slightly different manner. So let's talk about a few of those changes. I think you'll see here there are a number of areas where CECL and CECLSolver specifically, where it feels very similar to the things we've done in the past with the incurred loss methodology. And one of those reasons we like, for many of those reasons, we like the WARM methodology because of its similarities to the incurred loss model. First, CECL will be different in that we will be looking at losses over a longer life of the loan approach, instead of looking at losses over an annual or a couple of year look back period that most institutions do now with their current ALLL. Excuse me. Now you will make allowances for all losses over the life of the loan pool. So there are a number of similarities. We're still going to look at pools of assets, make Q factor adjustments, and make assumptions for justifying those Q factor adjustments. So we're going to build on some of those similarities, but make a few slight changes along the way. First, there is no one mandatory method for calculating your reserve under CECL. The NCUA has mentioned several different methodologies like the WARM method, but the choice is completely up to you. You choose your path, and you'll have to defend this with your examiners and absolutely understand where your final reserve number is coming from. And of course, document this appropriately. This will be the case for any tool or partner that you choose. The NCUA has also stated that your chosen reserve methodology should match the complexity of your portfolio. For most traditional credit unions under a few billion in asset size, a call report driven analysis using the WARM methodology will be perfectly acceptable. You do not need to engage in highly complex modeling or loan level analysis. When it comes to implementing CECL, there are some practical considerations. First, how much data do you have to collect? Do you have to have detailed loan level data going back at least 5 years? To do a more complex loan level analysis, you'll need to have this data collected and reconciled before you even start your first actual reserve calculation, a process that can take a couple of years. For other WARM options, what is the actual cost? Is it Excel-based? Is it software-based? Is it cloud-based? How much actual work do you think you'll have to allocate to calculating your reserve? Free options might not cost any money, but tend to be expensive in as far as your time is concerned. How about data from outside of your credit union? What have the loss trends been in your state? How do your losses compare to your peers? Having good internal data is important, but having comparable peer data will be very helpful, especially in areas where you have little to no losses. Peer data can help to establish reasonable and supportable CECL reserves and further support your reserve figures. In the end, we feel that CECLSolver hits that perfect balance of simplicity and automation while still giving you the ability to add complexity where necessary. In the very beginning, we saw the original guidance for CECL. The guidance was for more complex, more massive institutions, and we knew that would not work for most of our credit unions. We set out to create a CECL tool that was easy to use, collected the relevant data for you, and to create a CECL tool that was just easy to understand and follow. We also wanted to create a CECL solution that was quick to implement and easy to maintain from month to month or quarter to quarter. We feel we do have exactly what this is asking in what we call CECLSolver for our credit unions, which will bring us to our live demo. And with that said, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Steve.
Thank you, David. If everyone can give me just a moment while I get my screen pulled up. I think you need to, yes. Give me 1 second here. And should do it. Let me know when that pops up, David.
Yep, looking
Excellent.
good. I can see your screen.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. What you're seeing on the screen in front of you right now is exactly the way the tool would work for everyone on the call. Obviously, the data that we're using, our guinea pig for today is a relatively large credit union out of the Midwest, and they're a good example because they have lots of loans in lots of different buckets. So what you notice on the screen, kind of one of the first things you'll see about our tool is that we've designed our initial segmentation, at least by default, around the categories of loans that we can get, the segmentation that's available on the Form 5300 call reports that you guys and everybody else has to file every quarter. Lots of reasons why we do so. From a practical standpoint, it means that you don't have to enter all that data, right? Because we have call report segment data going back as far as we need to from a balance perspective, from a charge off and a recovery and a past due perspective. It means that you don't have to spend a lot of time in inputting historical financial data and reconciling your internal accounts with the external buckets that may be provided by someone else. And it's a real time saver. But from an even more methodological standpoint, it's critical that we start with some of these call report based segments because it allows us to use not just your internal loan data, but also look outside your four walls to the environment around you. Utilizing external data and in the form of peer data when it comes to making our qualitative factor adjustments is going to play a critical role. And the fact that we can get all the exact same data with the same buckets consistently and on an apples to apples basis really allows us a lot more flexibility and in justifying our Q factors when we get to that point in the analysis. So we start with that data, and the first time that you log into the tool, all of your historical data will be here on the screen in front of you. So it really is ready to go, sort of out of the box, so to speak. We've designed the tool so that you'll spend the vast majority of your time doing the things that are subjective, right? All the things that you as a management team have to do as a part of CECL is all those assumptions that you need to make and all the justification that you need to make in getting your reserve where it needs to be. That's where your time is best spent, not in pulling and reconciling accounts and dealing from a data perspective. Now, our entire tool lives in the cloud, meaning that you log in here, your data is ready to go, you build scenarios, you save them right here in the tool. You can come and access your saved scenarios and export them anytime you want to. And one of the big benefits of building it and designing it the way we did is that it, excuse me one second. As you change any inputs or assumptions, the entire tool recalculates pretty much instantaneously on the fly. It's very interactive. And that's hugely important when you're building scenarios and you're doing some what if analysis. Maybe you want to change an assumption about economic stress, or change a loss rate assumption, or see what would happen if a portfolio were to get larger or smaller. Some of the other tools that we've seen out there, or models that are more complex, you have to plug in hundreds of little assumptions, and then you get kind of an output report. And if you want to change one assumption, you have to run the entire thing over again. And it becomes very difficult to figure out what's really moving the needle, right? What's relevant to your situation, and what assumptions can you make that really won't change the output very much at all. Using our tool, it's almost instantaneous that you get that feedback as to, hey, you know, if we were to have a longer duration on our mortgage portfolio, or if we were to lean more in the direction of peers, or if we think the economy is going to improve in the near future, this is exactly how much impact that would have on our reserve process. So let's kind of just take a step back and walk through the tool on a step-by-step basis. As David mentioned, we're heavily utilizing the weighted average remaining maturity, or the WARM method. We certainly have some elements of other methodologies in there, most notably the snapshot open pool methodology is in there a bit as well, but it focuses heavily on the WARM method, which is certainly one of the more straightforward methodologies that's been vetted and approved by FASB and the NCUA. The first step in using the WARM method, or honestly, it's a step that you can't really get away from no matter what methodology you're using, is calculating some average remaining maturities of the loans you have on the books. That's a piece of work that, if you're not getting it, if you can't just request it from your core or from your ALM provider, you're going to have to do a little bit of work in calculating those average remaining maturities. You know, since CECL at its heart is all about estimating losses over the remaining lives of the pools or assets, we can't get around trying to get a handle on what the average remaining lives of them are. And unfortunately, for us at least, that's not something that we can get directly, at least from the call reports. You know, nowhere on the 5300s does it ask you guys to do any remaining life calculations. So we work with you on the front end in doing those WARM calculations. If you can't get them easily from your core or ALM provider, you'll be calculating them internally, and we provide a template to show you it's an Excel-based template which shows you step-by-step exactly what you need, how to get it from your Aries file, how to do the WARM calculations on a segment-by-segment basis. If utilizing this type of a tool and working with your loan level data is something that you just don't have the time or inclination to do, you can offload the entire process onto us, and you know, we can provide you a secure server that you can upload your Aries file to, and then we can do the WARM calculations for you on an ongoing basis. So rest assured, as much or as little assistance as you need in doing those WARM calculations kind of on the front end here, we can provide. But once we have those warm calculations, we plug them into the tool, and then really the tool is off and running and handling the vast majority of the number crunching for us so that we can just focus on the qualitative and the subjective elements, assumptions relevant to CECL. Let's pick a segment today to play with a little bit so you can kind of see, and we'll walk it all the way through to the final calculation so you understand exactly what's involved in the process. Let's say that we've done a warm calculation for all of our unsecured, all other unsecured loans or lines, or, well, let's use vehicles today, new vehicle loans. Let's say we did a warm calculation and we figured that the average remaining life of our new vehicle loans was 3.25 years. We do that calculation. As soon as we do it, it takes just about a couple seconds here, and everything just recalculated on the fly across the board for new vehicle loans, at least as it pertains to CECL. Now, what I mean by all that is, if we know the average remaining life is 3.25 years, we know what CECL is really requiring of us is that we project 3.25 years worth of total potential losses going forward on this segment, right? Losses over the remaining life of the assets is what CECL is getting at. So in order to do that, our tool takes a symmetrical approach to the look back period, meaning by default, if we're going to project 3.25 years going forward, we're going to start by looking at a 3.25 year period in your history and analyzing your experience. How do your balances change over that last 3.25 years? Or whatever 3.25 years you choose to use. The look back periods are customizable and flexible. How have charge-offs aggregated over that 3.25 year period? Have you had any recoveries? We'll take all that historical information to calculate what is the first big piece of the puzzle for CECL, and that is, what is our credit union's historical lifetime or life of the loan loss rate on this pool? The answer for this particular credit union for new vehicle loans is 32 basis points. There is obviously a ton of math that goes into that value right there. But luckily, since the warm methodology and our take on it is pretty straightforward, all of the supporting details coming from your call reports that go into this calculation can be found right here on the historical detail or historical analysis tab. When we click on that, this is all that supporting information. So first thing we're going to do is analyze your balances. So here are, if this was you, these would already be here the second you first log in. We can go back in time as far as we need to, and we can see how your balances have changed. All the same segmentation. These are all of the discrete loan segments that exist on your Form 5300 call report, right? And this is something, if you remember, probably now is as good a time as any to talk about it. In the first quarter, I'm sure in March 31st of this year, I'm sure you all noticed a significant change in the fields that they required on the call reports. This wreaked a lot of havoc throughout the industry when it came to CECL preparation, because what they did in effect is pretty much change the vast majority of all the buckets when it came to calculating charge-offs, tracking past due loans and charge-offs and recoveries. The exact information that is critical to have long-term trends for in order to properly estimate CECL. So they kind of made it as difficult as possible on us by changing all that as we're all ramping up to CECL. So we made some significant changes to our tool in order to account for all of the new segmentation that we now had access to, but also making sure that we still had some long-term historical trends in losses in order to help inform our CECL process. So you can see now we've got 20 completely discrete segments that we have loss data for and balance data for. For new vehicle loans, you can see that their balance of new vehicle loans has grew significantly until about 2019, and then shrank a little bit over the last couple of years. And over the 3.25 year look back period, they have averaged about $51 million in new vehicle loans. We are just kind of for reference and to make it easier to follow, we highlight the look back periods for each segment of the portfolio. And you'll notice there's different length blue bars or shading for each segment, because we are marrying the look back period to the warms. Just intuitively, because CECL, again, is all about estimating losses over the lives of the assets, makes sense to us that for the assets that have a longer life on average, we might have to go back further in history in order to see how it performs over a 7 or 8 year period if it has a 7 or 8 year duration. And for construction loans or other types of loans that have a much shorter average life, we typically don't need to go back that far in history to get a feel for how they perform over a lifetime. But we see here that's the new vehicle loan detail. Then we split into the detail on charge-offs and recoveries. This is where we've got legacy data, right? All the loss and recovery segments that we had prior to the first quarter of this year. If you remember, there were only 9 segments of loans that were additive when it comes to charge-offs and recoveries. All these other segments were in there, but as memo items, and they were sort of included in these values above, which made it a bit apples to oranges. But you can see and track all of your charge-offs and recoveries by segment with the legacy data, and also the charge-offs and recoveries starting this year with all of the updated segmentation. And what you end up with at the bottom is combined segmentation here and loss rates over time. And what we end up doing is looking at your loss rates in dollars and in percentages for each segment of your portfolio and aggregating them over time so we can calculate right here, lifetime loss rates. So you'll see 32 basis points is sort of the 3.25 year lifetime loss rate for new vehicle loans. If I head back over to the summary, there's that 32 basis points. So again, all the details behind that are right here within the tool, easy to track, trace, and audit. Now that's, once we've gotten that data and done that calculation, that's really the first half of CECL. The second half is all of the fudge factors, right? All of those cumulative, those qualitative factor adjustments that together cumulatively represent all the reasons we think current and future conditions might be a little bit different from the historical conditions which produced these rates that we just calculated. So again, it's all about look to your own history and then modify how you think things might be different in the future, and then add up those two, and then you get your expected future loss rates. You'll notice we have a column here in green for the peer loss rates. We're going to dig into that in just a moment. We'll have you know that the peer data kind of is kind of front and center in our analysis. However, we allow you to the choice to decide how much or how little you want to take into account the peer experience. By default, the peer data is all displayed, but it doesn't factor into your ultimate CECL calculation unless and until you make a Q factor adjustment to decide how much you want to take it into account. And so without further ado, let's dig right into the Q factors. So if you click on the Q factors tab here, this is where we can plug in all those adjustments we want to make to our historical experience for our best expectations moving forward. If we want to make an adjustment based upon peer trends, based upon economic conditions or other external factors, we have a bunch of economic trends that we can overlay over top of your historical loss experience and your peers' historical loss experience, so you can look for some correlations there. We also recently updated or enhanced this page just to include all those other potential Q factors, the quote suggested Q factors that have been part of our guidance for a long time now, because the idea of a Q factor is not new, right? With the incurred loss methodology that we've been all dealing with for decades now, there has been interagency guidance that gave us lists of suggested qualitative factor adjustments that we should consider in doing our ALLL calculation. So we have kind of faithfully recreated some of those suggested Q factor adjustments here. If you're curious where that comes from, if you're not familiar with these specific suggested adjustments, there is an interagency policy on allowances for credit losses, which is something that, you know, released back in 2000, in the 90s or early 2000s, which really talks about all that. You can peruse that if I think that would be helpful. But it certainly doesn't mean you need to use all these adjustments, right? This can certainly be overkill. You're not going to have values for every single Q factor adjustment for every segment of your portfolio. If you don't think the problem loan trends is really a helpful adjustment, you can simply remove it by clicking on that. If you want to add custom additional adjustments, maybe based upon local information or other things that are custom for your loan portfolio, you can add in custom qualitative factor adjustments as well, or use the suggested ones. As we make adjustments here, as we add an adjustment based upon any of these potential factors, the net qualitative factor adjustment recalculates, and the entire tool pretty much recalculates as you do it. So I made a couple of examples here of some adjustments we might make. And this is an important administrative tool here on the right. It's an input box where you start building your narrative and your justification or explanation for the assumptions that you've made here on this page. The nice thing about that is as you plug in that text, as you type that in, all the notes you make there get attached to that segment or that risk pool throughout the analysis. So whenever you save a scenario or export it to send it to an auditor or an examiner, those notes get attached and displayed there. So it makes it for a much easier paper trail when you're going through the audit or exam process. And also just internally, right? When you come back in here next quarter to update your analysis, you're going to want to have some copious notes here so that you can see, all right, this is exactly what I was thinking last quarter when I made this adjustment. And I can consider whether I think that still holds true or whether conditions have changed and I need to modify that. So the more notes, the merrier, right? So the old adage of document, document, document. You know, from a practical perspective, CECL in many ways is a lot like the reserve methodology we've always been dealing with, because when it comes down to it, we're dealing with people and they're simply asking you to make a bunch of reasonable assumptions and then justify why you think they're reasonable. So the documentation process is probably the most critical element of a satisfactory exam or an audit when it comes to CECL. Now, one of the critical inputs here, one of the critical qualitative factor adjustments, from our opinion, is going to be taking a look at the peer experience, looking at external data from outside your institution. And that's most helpful. I mean, it's always helpful, but it's really helpful if you, let's say you have a segment of your portfolio that simply has not been experiencing any losses over an extended period historically. Most of the credit unions on the call right now probably have at least one bucket that's been relatively or completely clean for many years. And we know intuitively that just because we haven't had any mortgage losses over the last 8 years doesn't mean that we can probably get away with having no reserve for our mortgage portfolio, right? We just know that we're going to have to justify whatever that reserve is using something other than our loss internally because we don't have any. That's when we look outside our four walls. We look at the peer experience and we say, how can we get apples to apples segment level peer loss data that we can really compare to our historical lifetime loss rate? I know that was a mouthful right there, but this is how we do it. When we were doing this analysis on your credit union, where we look at all your balances, all your charge-offs and recoveries by segment over these custom look-back periods, we were actually doing that same entire analysis for every single other credit union in your peer group simultaneously in the background. So sorry about that. I keep getting all these email pop-ups. Give me just 1 second to get rid of that. There we go. So we were crunching literally millions and millions of call report data points for all the other credit unions in your neck of the woods or in your size range in order. And if we took all that data and sort of average it all out, we would get this. What this tab represents are weighted average loss rates by segment using the same exact segmentation, so apples to apples, that we're using for your credit union, and overlaying your look back periods on them. So we can calculate, in effect, lifetime loss rates for your peer group based upon your custom look back periods that you can compare to yours to make judgment calls and modify through Q factors. Now, when I say your peer group, what am I talking about? So since obviously when you're using external data like this, you need to make sure that your examiners are going to be comfortable with your choice of peer groups. So we go to the source, right? Well, how does the NCUA, split up credit unions and compare you to peers from a financial standpoint? They're pretty straightforward, right? The NCUA has 6 peer groups that they look at. Based on asset size, peer group 1 are all the smallest credit unions under 2 million in assets. all the way up to peer group 6, which is all the credit unions over $500 million in total assets. Now they just do it nationally, but we took it a step further and allow you to zoom in or out geographically as well. So this credit union is over a little over $1 billion in loans, I believe, and so they're in the largest peer group 6. And right now we're looking at national peers. So the data you're looking at here includes pretty much every asset quality point over the last 15 years for every single credit union over $500 million in the entire United States, large peer group. If we want to zoom into just the Western region or just Wisconsin, I believe that these guys are from Wisconsin, I could zoom into the state or regional level to get a more specific localized peer group. So you have full flexibility there in that you can also, if you want to take a look and see what peer loss trends are for slightly smaller credit unions, you can go and look at peer group 5 or peer group 4. And just putting my analyst hat on here for a second, I could have a field day just with this page, just by saying, well, what happens to other credit unions in our state as they get larger when it comes to used vehicle losses, right? Do bigger credit unions in our state have higher losses on vehicle loans or lower losses? Which can help inform what your reserve process needs to look like if you anticipate growing significantly. You could do an analysis on that just by playing around with what peer group you look at or what geographic region you look at on this page and having all this data update on the fly. But when you have this data, let's say you've had zero, we'll use the example for this credit union. They've got not a lot, but they have some student loans on the books. And if they had a 7-year look back period, over the last 7 years, this credit union has had a sum total of 0 net charge-offs on their student loans. However, other similar sized credit unions in the environment around them are averaging about 1.64% losses on student loans over that same historical 7-year look back period. This allows them a great defensible data point in order to come into their Q factors and say, I can't get away with zero reserve on my student loans, so I'm going to put in 50 basis points here based upon the fact that I know my peers are seeing losses of 1.5%. So that's how the process would work in utilizing the peer data and other qualitative factors in order to modify your historical results for what you expect to see moving forward. Once you've plugged in all your Q factors, you come back to the summary, it sums all those Q factors up right here. You also, by the way, if you want a practical expedient, if you want to do some spitballing and don't feel like going through this entire process of the detailed Q factors, you can always just come in here and throw in a net Q factor adjustment. If you want to see what impact it would have on the tool, I type in 1%, and it just all recalculated on the fly. So you can kind of forego the detailed Q factor process and just do a summary number if you want to see how it would impact the tool. Once we've made all of our adjustments, we have come to our expected future loss rate, right? It's simply our historical experience plus or minus the sum total of all of our adjustments to it is equal to what we expect in the future. And we take that loss rate, a lifetime loss rate, and apply it to our current balances. Now, when I say current balances, the most current value that we are going to have access to on an automated basis is coming from your most recent call report. So right now, these would be June 30th. However, you'll notice all these balances are completely overridable, which means that you're not limited to running this tool once a quarter or simply only based upon your quarter end values. You can come in here as of any point in time, any date you want to, and override these quarter end balances with the month end balances or today's GL balance. And the analysis and calculation, CECL calculation, will be as of that point in time that you plug in your current balances. This is also the spot where you would make any adjustments to your current pool balances if you have any balances that are outside the scope of CECL, right? If you have a large government guaranteed portfolio of SBA program loans, the government guaranteed portion, if it has no risk of loss, which it typically doesn't, you'd want to net out here, right? Any balance where if you were to have a loss, it wouldn't be coming out of your reserve, right? You don't need to establish reserve against that portion of it. So let's say we had, 10 million in SBA program loans. I subtract 10 million here. I come into the notes and I make a note that we netted out 10 million SBA guarantees. Again, you can make notes here all throughout the tool. There's various spots where you can make notes at the segment level for anything that's relevant for you or your audit trail or examiners. And next quarter, when you come back in, you'll see exactly why you made the adjustments. Once we have those current balances, the last piece of the puzzle is dealing with any individually assessed loans. So under CECL, we haven't completely gotten away from having to deal with some loans that simply don't have any risk characteristics that are similar to any other loans in your portfolio. And that would mean if you simply can't pool them with the rest of your loans because default is imminent, for example, and you have a relatively good idea of what that loss might be, this is where you can come in and deal with some of those one-off loans. We just ask you to plug in the loan detail, let us know what bucket or call report segment it's coming from so that we don't double count our losses. And you can plug that data in here, and then it appropriately gets stripped out of or culled from the herd, so to speak, and subtracted from the collective pool, and so we're not double counting it. Once we've done that process, we come back here, we do some simple math, we get an implied CECL calculation for each segment, we add them all up, we get a total CECL requirement for the collective pools. This is where we add back in the reserve for the individually assessed loans that we got on our separate tab here. You'll also notice we've just recently added another line item for the held to maturity securities portfolio. So there's a couple areas that most credit unions do not need to spend very much time or spend a ton of time pulling their hair out about, because it's a small or completely negligible piece of the puzzle from a CECL perspective. HTM security is one of them. Under CECL, it's not only about the loan portfolio. FASB is requiring us to look at any securities that we might have real credit risk in and estimate what potential losses we might have in that part of our balance sheet. Now, it only really applies to held to maturity securities. Again, assets that are on the books at amortized costs, so not the available for sale securities that's on the books at fair market value. This credit union, as you can see, has $500 million worth of securities. They are all available for sale. None of them are held to maturity, and so they don't really have to worry about this at all. If you do have any held to maturity securities on your books, they are probably mostly or all government guaranteed or government sponsored entities or whatnot, and they don't really have any risk of credit default either. And so it's a small piece of the puzzle. If you did have any real corporate debt or whatnot on the books that does have risk of credit loss, this is where you'd manage it, and it would factor its way back into the summary. Once we made all those adjustments, we also have a module here for the unfunded commitments. This is the other area where you probably don't need to spend a huge amount of time digging, pulling your hair out about this, because it's just not a huge piece of the puzzle for the vast majority of credit unions. But under FASB, under CECL, FASB is requiring us to look at the unfunded commitments and make a separate estimate of, hey, for all of your unfunded commitments, if they were to be funded, what kind of losses might we see, and actually set aside a reserve for it separately. So we provided a module here to get you started on that part of the process. It involves, taking your total unfunded commitments by segment. We can pull that data off the call reports for you, and then working with you to, first off, we can net out any unfunded commitments that are, quote, unconditionally cancelable. That means, well, I can use an example to explain. Unused credit card lines are pretty much the definition of unconditionally cancelable, right? At any given point in time, you can freeze that additional credit or remove that additional credit, so you're not legally obligated to extend that credit for an indeterminate period going forward. If that's the case, we can net those balances out. Overdraft protection program commitments also typically fit the bill legally of unconditionally cancelable. If we net those out, you'll find a large portion of your unfunded commitments have disappeared, but whatever's left over is your net unfunded commitment. Once we have that value, we have to jump through some mental hoops here, because in effect, What they're really asking you to do, as ridiculous as it might sound, is they want you to project future long-term potential losses on loans that don't really exist yet, right? So we had to, it's a bit of a stretch, but that's what they're requiring of us to do. So we have to start by estimating what the probability of funding these unfunded commitments is. Now, that's a value that most credit unions don't simply have sitting around waiting for analysis. And most ALM providers and cores don't even know how to start helping you with that type of a calculation. And the NCUA themselves don't have a lot of guidance on it. So where everyone is a little bit of it's a challenge to get some real good justifiable values for probability of funding if you don't do that analysis internally. We've given you some good defensible starting points or default values here, and we get them from the NCUA's risk-based capital guidelines, where they did what they called credit conversion factors, and they did some calculations and did some studies on what they call credit conversion factors, which is really just their guesstimate of likelihood of funding for unfunded lines. We start there, then we estimate the average remaining life of the commitments. A lot of times that just defaults to 1 year, because in a lot of your contractual language, a lot of the unfunded commitments are renewable or reviewable on an annual basis. And then if they were to be funded, what kind of losses might we see? Now, we already have some good analysis of that, because we already did that analysis right here, right? We looked at your loan portfolio and got a feel for what kind of losses you might expect. So we have good default values there to start. You do some math there, and it ends up giving you an unfunded commitment amount, a shortfall or surplus. Typically, it's a shortfall because most credit unions aren't already doing this type of analysis. It is going to be a line item on the call report starting March 31st of next year. So you will need to do a calculation there of some sort. And so we help you out with it. All that being said, that's pretty much the end of it. You add those all up, you get a total CECL requirement. You compare it to what your current reserve is as of that same point in time, and we're left with a surplus or a shortfall. Those are the steps in how to run the tool at any given point in time. From a tool management standpoint, once you've built a scenario, very much like we've done here on the call, you want to make sure that you save that scenario before you go logging out or anything else and lose your work. Save it as a new scenario, give it a name, give it a date. As soon as you create it, then it is saved securely on our servers, never to be lost. You can come and access your scenarios anytime you want to. You can build as many scenarios as you want to. In fact, this drop-down box of save scenarios will go down forever if you want it to. There's no extra charge for saving additional scenarios or anything like that. In fact, as a best practice, we highly suggest every time you come back in here and plug in any new financial information or update it in any meaningful way with newer or more relevant data, that you do save it as a new scenario and give it a new date and a name, so that you can go back and compare scenarios over time. And so you can track how your CECL reserve is changing as we get closer to implementation date, right? That's one of the things that the NCUA wants to see when they talk about doing parallel runs. Inherent in that is, well, what's the difference between your reserve and your potential CECL reserve as of June? Well, what about as of September? Did the gap between those two get bigger or smaller? Those are the questions that they're asking that you'll need to want to have a handle on. It's also practical by building multiple scenarios for a single point in time, so that you can have an optimistic scenario and then maybe a more economically pessimistic scenario and compare them. You can toggle between those two scenarios right here and in real time see exactly how much that change in maybe economic assumption moves the needle. So you can say, listen, you can present a range of reserves to your examiners when you first show them this and say, depending upon how you read the tea leaves, we can see anywhere between 2 and 3 million. Where do you guys fall on that? So you can kind of almost, get some additional ammunition and put the onus back on the burden back on your examiners to give you feedback as to where they kind of expect you to land at the end of all this by building some multiple scenarios and sharing them all with your examiners. Once you've built your scenarios and it's time to share it with the board or auditor or externally, you'll want to export it. We give you full control over how much of a tool you export and to what format you export it. If you're sending something to the board on a quarterly basis, they certainly don't want too much granular detail or their eyes are going to glaze over. So you'll just give them the summary results. Whereas an auditor, I am sure, would want the whole kit and caboodle. And you can add in all the historical detail, the peer data, summary of key factors and your notes, all of the summary charts, and everything else, and a PDF or Excel format. The Excel format retains all the spacing and shading and formatting, visual formatting, so that you can make notes, add columns and rows at will, and still print it off in sort of a manageable way. One thing that I did not point out, I believe, was in the Q Factors tab. Sorry, I forgot about this, but we have a great chart here. This is kind of a summary of all the most relevant aspects of the CECL for one segment of the portfolio. And as you click through the portfolio, you get to see in one visualization, you know, what's our long-term trend in losses. That's the blue bars. What is our peers' long-term trend in losses? That's the green lines. What's the look back period that we're using to start our CECL estimate? That's the shaded gray area. And what is our total CECL reserve estimate compared to our losses and our peers' trends? All of that is summarized in one chart here, which is interactive, so that when you click throughout different parts of the portfolio, you can see that. This is really helpful if you're curious about a segment that you don't have loans in. Let's say you don't do any construction or development loans, but you're thinking you might get into that in the future. You can click on this and see exactly what kind of loss trends other similar size credit unions in your neck of the woods are having or have had in the long run in that segment of their portfolio, even if you don't have any loans there. So a lot of good data you can get from doing this. And again, you can also go and take a look at overlay some other economic trends, PPI for farm products, treasuries, inflation expectations, and see if you can glean some data information from that as well. So a very practical visuals here. These are great for sharing with the board so they can visually kind of understand what CECL means for different segments of the portfolio. At this point, I think I've shown you guys everything I wanted to here on the interactive tool. We do have some resources that go along with the tool, a user guide that's step-by-step and very visual, just to help remind you, if you haven't looked at this in a few months, refresh your memory as to how to run the tool and how to update it, a methodology guide and a white paper, a draft of an implementation letter, something your examiners love to see in your folder. It gives you some kind of initial draft policy language that you can do when you're redrafting your reserve policy to make it CECL compliant. This is another link to that Excel-based WARM estimator tool. Again, you can utilize that. You can save it, do what you will with it. You can use it to calculate your WARMs. We'll use it to calculate your WARMs if you need our help doing it. Here is some guidance on prepayment assumptions. A critical element in the remaining maturity calculation process is estimating what levels of prepayments you might see moving forward. That plays a very large role in your reserve calculation when it comes to mortgage products, right? Your average 30-year mortgage loan doesn't typically have a life of longer than 7 or 8 years from birth to death. Why? Because of prepayments. So if you're not factoring prepayments into your WARM calculations, you are shooting yourself in the foot big time and probably way overestimating your required reserve. I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to talk about that on a one-off basis if anyone wants to give us a buzz and chat about what I mean by that. This is in our SOC 1 report for all of you who need that for your due diligence process. We have had the tool looked at very carefully from auditors and accountants and had a SOC 1 validation process completed recently. And these are some of the better presentations we've seen by FASB and the NCUA and some of those interagency regulatory panels that included, the NCUA and FASB and the FDIC and the Fed that talked not only about CECL in general, but the more straightforward WARM type methodologies that are becoming much more prevalent for most. When I say small and less complex credit unions, I'm talking about everybody on the call here, right? When they say small and less complex credit unions can probably be fine with a WARM-based method, they mean anybody that's not gigantic and very complex. It's not like there's a $50 million cutoff where if you've got more than 50 million in loans, you're somehow not small and you are complex. That cutoff point, while no one will ever define it for you, is more along the lines of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 billion with a B dollars in loans or higher. We have, I think, over 300 credit unions using our CECLSolver tool that are signed up, subscribed to use it at this point, and they range from $9 or $10 million in total assets up to over 3 or 4 or $5 billion in total assets that all utilize our tool. So just to give you guys an idea of, it's not a small range that this could be appropriate for. It's a very large, it probably encompasses 90% of the credit unions in the country from our perspective. And at this point, I think I've pointed out everything I wanted to here. And so I'm going to turn the presentation back over to David here. There's a couple slides we have. Well, let me stop showing my screen here. David, if you want to pull back up your presentation. And I know we just did this. Yes.
No, I was just saying thank you, Steve.
Yep. I'll let you know when it pops up. I don't see it yet.
All right. Should have popped up already, but
I don't know. It hasn't. I don't think you're sharing the screen yet again.
Hang on just 1 second to get used to that.
So when he pulls the screen back up, even though we just did this kind of live on our website, I wanted to, if you were going to be printing out this presentation that we did today, I wanted to have at least a couple slides that you could physically print out that kind of summarize how the tool works. And so there are 3 or 4 slides that are on the PDF that we'll be sending around today that summarize everything I just went through. The fact that we're using a warm-based methodology, and the entire tool is interactive. There we go. Yep. The entire tool is interactive. All your data is there the second you first log in. There's very little data input required. The only manual labor or kind of legwork, grunt work, you might say, is using your loan level data to calculate those warms on the front end. And don't let that scare you off. If you're having trouble doing the warm calculations, or you say, listen, it's not rocket science, I know how to do it, I just don't have the time, that's fine. We'll show you how to how to upload your Aries files to our server, and we can do that process for you. And again, you run the tool, it's all interactive. As you save scenarios, you can access them anytime you want to. If you need a multiple logins or users, we can give you as many licenses as you need. There's no additional cost for any of that kind of stuff. Next slide, David. I already went over this. You can go to the next slide. And one thing that we just added to the tool, it's not specifically part of a CECL tool, but since we've started aggregating and gathering all the call report data on every single credit union in the country for a few years now, we thought, there's a lot of other stuff we can show you guys with this data. And we started getting requests from our CECL users, hey, if we just wanted a kind of a basic financial overview of our credit union over time, and we wanted to kind of look at performance and maybe compare ourselves to some peers, or even just research a peer, short of going and downloading their Form 5300 and killing a bunch of trees, is there any way you can provide kind of a quick dashboard on financial performance for credit unions? So we went about doing that. This is something that you all get for free. If you've subscribed to our CECL tool, you'd have access to look at this type of financial data on your credit union or any other credit union in the country. If you go to the next slide, David, it's also a great way, this is kind of a filtering tool, what we call Credit Union Universe at a glance. This is a great way to see who else is in your peer group. If your peer group you're using for CECL is all of the credit unions that are $50 to $100 million in assets in Wisconsin, and you want to say, well, who's in that peer group? What are those credit unions and what do they look like? You can come to this page here. You can sort by state. You can sort by asset size, any of these fields here, and you can get a snapshot of what all those other similar credit unions in your neck of the woods look like and how they've been performing. Again, no extra charge. It's just something we wanted to provide with the tool. You can print this, you can export it to Excel or PDF, whatever you need to do. Next slide. And at this point, I'm going to hand it back, the talking back over to David.
Thanks, Steve. So the next thing we want to talk about, as far as as far as support for CECLSolver, Attention important.
And we've kind of gone over this. You can flip to the next slide. This is just we did we have a couple slides that we added in here just to remind everyone of the truly monumental change in call report accounting codes that we all had to deal with as an industry in March 31st and what impact it had on CECL. If I was a credit union, a typical size credit union trying to do CECL by myself using an Excel-based template that I had built, and I had got that all ready to go, and then this March they changed all the call report codes on me, it's a challenge. And if it was difficult before, it'd be almost impossible to get good long-term loss trends with that shift that we had. So this is just kind of a summary of what that looked like and how you might kind of get your data the way it needs to be and still see long-term trends. So you can skip ahead a couple.
Wonderful timing on that part.
We've gone through this as well.
Yep.
There we go.
Talked about. Yep. So as far as any kind of support on warm, Steve has mentioned this a little bit just a few minutes ago. If you can't get help from your data providers, from your ALM, from your core to get information to be able to put it into our warm estimator, we can certainly do that part for you. There's a little bit of data that you send us, and most of it comes from your Aries file. You're able to securely send that to us via Citrix's share file. We take over the data part. There may be a few questions we have for you, but we make it quite easy for you. And as Steve mentioned, of our 300 plus credit unions, more and more have added what we call data mapping to their subscriptions, meaning that we're doing the warm portion for them every single quarter, which makes it a lot easier on the credit union, makes it a lot faster process, and less time consuming for the credit union. As far as your next steps, we would love for you all to reach out if you would like a personalized tour from either myself or Jason Heinrich, the other sales representative at QuickRate, to help you with CECLSolver and talk about your specific situation. We can certainly do that. We also have a coffee talk that Steve and Sean O'Brien, our president, do once a month, or is it twice a month now, Steve?
No, just once a month. Every month we do what we call a coffee talk. You know, we were talking about this late last year, and we realized that everybody had a bit of not only COVID fatigue, but everyone also had CECL presentation fatigue. We've all been seeing these presentations from the accountants and from the regulators for like 4 years now, or more, 5 years now, when it comes to CECL. And we thought everyone was kind of sick and tired of seeing another canned presentation. But people had questions. You know, our current users and our interested potential users had questions about implementation, about day one accounting, about changes in, you know, what we're seeing from coming out of exams and audits where people are already trying to implement CECL. And so we made it a much more informal session where our credit union, anyone can attend. You can ask questions. We'll answer them live on the fly. We bring in guests. We've had 2 different auditing firms come in and opine about questions that you can sort of ask them in a risk-free or an anonymous environment if you'd like. And that format's been super popular. We get a couple hundred people log in every month when we do our coffee talk. So if that's, and a lot of the same people log in every month because we talk about different topics and different stuff that's CECL related. I don't know how fun you can make CECL, but we do our best to keep it light and help everybody out on those monthly coffee talks. So we'd love it if you all could join us for that. Or even if you can't join us on the 16th at 11:30 exactly, go ahead and register for it. And you can click on this link. It'll be a live link on the PDF we send out. And if you register for it and you can't attend, we'll send you a video of the entire webinar afterwards so that you can listen to it at your leisure. Perfect. And one other thing to add about this, a lot of the questions usually from the different credit unions, which, you know, is for a very good reason, is a little bit vague in these webinars. Our pricing on CECLSolver is asset-based. So if you're curious about pricing for your particular credit union, just let us know. We'll send you to the right person. That'll either be myself, David Suri, or Jason Heinrich, and we'll get you the pricing for your particular institution. Again, it's just simply asset-based.
But beyond that, I don't see any questions that have come in for this particular webinar. So with that, I would like to thank Steve Huntington for your time today. Thank you so much for the in-depth knowledge about CECLSolver. I think, Steve, unless you have anything else to add, we will call it a day.
Nope, I'd love, again, join us for the coffee talk, or if you just want to take a look at this tool live online with your data. So we're talking specifically about your situation and your loan portfolio. That's what we do on our walkthroughs. It's not generic. We will be using your data when we do the walkthrough. It's a great way to really get a feel for exactly how our tool would work, so there's no surprises when the day comes. So give us a buzz.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.